Sitting on my desk is a little handheld device. Inside of it is a micro SD card the size of a fingernail, and on that is every Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, and Game Boy game ever released. In 2022, emulation is in a great place. There are dozens of dedicated handheld machines like mine on the market, and high-quality ROMs can be downloaded from places like the Internet Archive, not to mention the wealth of translations and hacks that are available. But it wasn't always this way. In this episode of Forgotten Worlds, I want to take you back in time to the emulation scene of the late 90s and early 2000s. The internet of the Y2K era was a much more chaotic place than it is now. While the now familiar structures of the internet were beginning to take shape as blogs and early social media began to blossom, for most people it was a dark, shapeless sea dotted with islands, websites. People would cruise across the web, wandering from port to port, pointed in the direction of other destinations by webmasters or fellow travelers. It wasn't as simple as Googling something you wanted because search engines weren't as developed as they are now. You had to go poking around. And if you were lucky, maybe you'd hear about a place where buried treasure lay waiting. Early emulation sites were those kinds of places, but the metaphor sort of falters here because you weren't really taking anything away from anyone by downloading ROMs and emulation programs, aside from bandwidth. If anything, you were making it easier for other people to find them. Before dedicated services like Kazaa and LimeWire blew up, downloading and swapping ROMs was many people's first exposure to the concept of file sharing. ROMs were relatively small files, which made them easy enough to download on even dial-up connections. And the low system requirements of early emulators like ZSNES and Nesticle meant that emulation was feasible even for people without cutting-edge gaming PCs. What was so exciting to me about emulation wasn't getting to play familiar games on my computer. It was trying out titles that you would never otherwise get the chance to. For example, plenty of Dragon Ball games were released in Japan and parts of Europe for the Super Nintendo. But the franchise wasn't well established enough in the US at the time for these games to get a North American release. Through the magic of emulation, we were able to play French and Japanese versions of games like Hyperdimension and Super Butoden, titles that fed our appetite for more of the colorful anime worlds that we were slowly being introduced to on TV. Goku and friends might still have been on Namek in the anime, but these games let us explore the far reaches of Dragon Ball and other series, fueling schoolyard and forum rumors about our favorite characters. Emulators let us do more than just play games, though. They gave us a glimpse into how games worked by letting us pull apart sprite and background layers, mess around with sound channels, and use save states to experience games in new ways. This was especially useful for sprite artists and musicians, and was the beginning of an explosion of creative work online. In this way, emulation showed us that video games didn't just come into being fully formed. They were objects assembled by people using a range of skills. And the ability to dive into their components gave us an appreciation of the craft involved in their production. Still, it was hard to find all this stuff. That's where people like Zophar came in. In 1996, he started Zophar's Domain, a site dedicated to rounding up all of the emulation tools and patches anyone might be interested in. The site itself never hosted ROMs, which spared it from the legal issues that brought down a number of long-running pages like 1 Minute Left in the Second Period and EMU Paradise. And it's still running today. In conversation with Zophar, he told me that his motivation behind launching the site was to preserve the titles he already owned and enjoyed, but that were beginning to become unplayable due to the fallibility of the original hardware. Others in the emulation scene at the time were more interested in what might be more straightforwardly called piracy, but the lines always seemed kind of blurry back then. There were all kinds of ideas floating around about the legality of emulation, like that it was legal to own a backup if you had the physical cartridge, or that it was fine to download a ROM if you deleted it within 24 hours. Of course, companies like Nintendo began to crack down on sites hosting commercial ROMs in the 2000s, eventually setting up their own paid services like the Wii Virtual Console. But as more and more time passes and the back catalogs of many developers lie dormant, the moral question of emulation seems to have shifted. Whereas once it seemed like a dubious proposition to emulate games, in the modern era, emulation has become one of the main channels for the preservation of games that publishers don't have any interest in making available. Take a series like Lunar, one of Zophar's favorites. The original title for the Sega CD isn't playable on any modern hardware, nor are the re-releases on the PSP and Game Boy Advance. Of course, the rights holders are legally allowed to do whatever they want with those games. But where does that leave players who want to try them out? Unless they want to shell out hundreds of dollars for used copies, money which won't go to the original developers, they've got to emulate them. 20 years ago, emulation was kind of a novelty. Why would you want to play old games on your computer when new ones were coming out? Now, though, the fact that many older games are playable at all today owes to the early and ongoing efforts of people who wanted to preserve the games they love, and those who worked to translate titles to make them available to new audiences. It was their efforts, met with indifference to outright hostility from big corporations, that kept older works alive and cultivated a broader appreciation for retro games and the history of the medium. That's all for this episode of Forgotten Worlds. If you have any memories of the emulation scene in the early 2000s, please share them in the comments. And until next time, stay safe out there in cyberspace.